The UN, or the UN, is a socialist outfit that is different in reality from what we are taught, and in analyzing their symbol, we find the world surrounded by the laurel wreath, which is a symbol that is constant in the Roman Empire and can also be found in Napoleonic France, in the Soviet Union, and other places. President of the UN is referred to as His Excellency. The inaugural holder and first president was Paul Henry Spaak, and the UN, or the UN, was founded in 1946. Now let's take a look at who is Paul Henry Spaak. On his Wikipedia page, it is listed that Paul Henry Charles Spaak, born 25th of January 1899, and died 31st of July 1972, was an influential Belgian socialist politician, and he helped in establishing the European Union, and of course he was a member of the Belgian Workers' Party. Now, for those of you who don't understand what those words mean, because they, on the Wikipedia propagandists, attempt to avoid stating what that actually means, that is essentially a Nazi or a National Socialist, although the Nazis were specific to Germany. But this also means that any of Spaak's spawn will also be Nazis or National Socialists, or just socialists. They all mean the same thing, basically. And we see the same patterns reflected in the assemblies of the United States, Mexico, the UN, and France, which all have a similar architectural structure. Now, it is apparently impossible to withdraw from the United Nations, as it is not provided in the United Nations Charter, and this is also known as once a subject, always a subject, which led to the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain. And when we look at some headlines talking about this subject, we see there is no guideline, no mechanism, and it's not provided for any way for a country to be removed from the UN. Or the UN. And of course, Brexit was about this very issue, although that is reported to have revolved only around exiting the European Union. And then if we take a trip to Ecuador, we will find some examples of the UN's socializing efforts. In the Yasuni ITT initiative, over 1 billion barrels of oil were attempted to be put in the ground under the Yasuni National Park. And this apparently was aimed to protect indigenous people living in voluntary isolation. How convenient. And the reserve had around 846 million barrels. And this, of course, was done after pledges totaling 200 million by 2012 were given to the Ecuadorian government, or at least individuals in the Ecuadorian government. And one of these officials was Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces, who was actually not listed in the Wikipedia article on the initiative, despite being the president of the United Nations General Assembly during that period. She was also a Minister of National Defense of Ecuador under President Lenin Moreno. Of course, that is rather coincidental that he bears the name Lenin, considering another individual in Russia had that name. And then Espinosa was born in Salamanca, Spain, not actually born in Ecuador. And in her profile it says that she led the Yasuni ITT initiative. And it was not entirely done by Rafael Correa, as was listed in the initiative article. Now this leads us into a different topic, and that is the idea of the economic lever using gas prices. Now gas, or gasoline, or petroleum products are directly connected to the petroleum dollar. And therefore, a raising of the gas price, or lowering of it, gives a direct mechanism to affect, raise and lower, essentially, the economy. And it's no surprise that all of our US-based oil companies can trace their ancestry directly to the Standard Oil Company, mainly those being Exxon, Chevron, BP, and Marathon. Now this program, run by the UN and its subsidiaries, is entirely based off of control of entry, although this is very different from the military's entry control points, which are designed for security and not business purpose. When we look at vehicle traffic, whether that be on the road or in the air, it is a good analogy would be that the UN closes the roads and then they divert traffic onto toll roads where they run their immigration business. And that is what the border crossings are, essentially. They're toll roads. And when we look at the way to get a referral to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, we are directed to contact the local UNHCR office, or the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, USRAP, by UNHCR. So what is UNHCR? Well, it is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee. Interesting that you have to go through a UN outfit to be referred to a US-based refugee program, alleged refugee program. And of course, the largest donors to the UNHCR are the United States, the European Union, and Germany. Although, I don't know if those could be considered donation, more like payments to a holding company. And then they do this by cutting off alternative routes and funneling traffic with only one option, essentially building a transit monopoly. And we see this when there are no passenger trains in Mexico. And the attempted building of a passenger train remains controversial with environmentalists and indigenous rights activists. How coincidental. Couldn't be any financial interest behind that controversy. Now when we look at the Immigration Acts of the US, we find a general purpose behind supporting the immigration business, but also in supporting socialist policies and agendas, or Nazi policies and agendas. In the Page Act of 1875, which banned Chinese women from migrating to the United States, and then of course the Chinese Exclusion Act banned all members of the Chinese ethnic or national group, as it's stated here. And this was done using a US-China Burlingame Treaty of 1868, which of course treaties surpass or are considered above the US Constitution and laws of the land, separate and also more important because the US government is a subsidiary of the UN, and it was only intended to last for 10 years. Seems similar to their rhetoric on the pandemic. And it was strengthened in 1892 with the Geary Act and was made permanent in 1902. Of course, it was not affected for all Chinese, as diplomats, teachers, students, merchants, and travelers were exempt, meaning those with a social acceptability, or basically allies of Nazis. And in the Immigration Act of 1917, they established literacy tests, which probably had nothing to do with being literate in English, but rather literate in socialism, and created new categories of inadmissible persons. And then in the Emergency Quota Act, notice the word emergency, undesirables were not allowed in the United States, and it was intended as temporary legislation. It's interesting that the writer of this article knew what their intent was when they built this unlawful act, and it imposed numerical limits and the use of a quota system, and it limited the number of immigrants from any country. Of course, professionals were to be admitted without regard to their country of origin. I bet those professionals would be your socially acceptable allies of the Nazis that run the government and the UN. And then in the Immigration Act of 1924, the formation of the U.S. Border Patrol was authorized by the act. So I suppose the United States must not have existed before 1924, since we are told that without it, the U.S. basically can't exist. So that's interesting that that was imposed in 1924. And of course, naturally, congressional opposition was minimal. And then in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, a 7-category preference system was imposed, and another numerical limit on immigration. Of course, all of these run in the face of the Constitution, which states that a uniform immigration policy needs to be established by Congress alone and not executive orders, although these acts are technically from Congress, even though they're nothing but they're not anywhere near uniform. And then we find a very suspicious outfit called the Order Sons of Italy in America. That is a cultural and civil rights organization which was behind one of these acts. And when we look further into the Italian American organization, which promotes closer cultural relations between the United States and Italy, and they have subsidiaries in the Sons of Italy Foundation, which gave US $163 million to scholarships, medical research, cultural preservation, disaster relief, and other causes. That sounds a lot like bribery. And the Commission for Social Justice. Notice the word social as in socialist or socialism. The CSJ successfully worked to remove from the air what CSJ deemed offensive and derogatory national advertising campaigns. Well, that sounds like censorship, and this group seems like they might be the mafia. Lyndon Baines Johnson was quoted as establishing the idea of the Great Society, where he said that no youngster will go unschooled. Sounds like unindoctrinated is what he would rather say. And that they will assemble the best thought and broadcast knowledge from all over the world to find these answers. That sounds like propaganda and bring in more allies of Nazis. And he intends to establish working groups toward the Great Society. I don't think Hitler could have said it better. And then Johnson directed his task forces to work in secret so that they would not be derailed by public criticism. And of course, it was led by governmental experts and academics, which are probably all socialist. And most of the proposal obviously had not yet been reviewed. That is usually called railroading and has a bunch of other, basically considered bad. And then naturally the policies of the Great Society were expanded under the administrations of Republican presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, which of course shows a nonpartisan collusion between all of the socialists that reside in Congress, or Nazis. And this has extended constitutional protections to Native Americans on reservations. Now, the United States corporation is structured differently than what we're taught, and it is led by a board of directors from the United Nations. Of course, the executive branch is staffed by the president, or the CEO, and the financial branch is the Congress or Human Resources Department. And then the judiciary is your legal department, and that forms the U.S. corporation with agencies and departments below. Now, if we take a trip to the UN headquarters again, then we will find UNICEF, which is specifically related to children. And they are the central component of Child Protective Services, which of course are very infamous and inflict horrifying actions on citizens and people, on families all over the world, and on children, and they're just bad. But UNICEF's goal is to lobby governments and other partners to develop laws and strengthen child protection systems to prevent and respond to violence and abuse. Now, this is a classic form of doublespeak, where what we think they mean is not what they actually mean. And of course, they advocate for legal birth registration of all newborns, staking claim over the property of human beings from birth, essentially. And then they work with communities and faith-based organizations, probably Jesuits, to change harmful societal norms that make children more vulnerable to exploitation. Of course, when we read that, we think one thing, but what they actually mean is that they aim to make children more vulnerable for pedophiles. And they support the training of professionals working with children, including social workers, health workers, and police and border officials to help stop trafficking. It's interesting that they don't actually want to stop trafficking, but rather help to stop trafficking. And of course, these are usually called departments of social services. I'm sure something similar existed in the Nazi Reich with the same name. Anyway, Child Protective Services strive to ensure safe, permanent, nurturing families for children by protecting them from abuse and neglect while attempting to preserve the family unit. Now, they don't want to preserve the family unit, they only want to be seen as attempting to preserve it and striving to ensure safe, permanent, nurturing family units. The other agencies provide clients with specialized services, places children in foster care. And of course, that's Texas Child Protective Service. How oddly honest of them. And then if the social services for the Nazi pedophiles are involved in your life, it's because someone was concerned about the health and safety of your child and notified CPS. Of course, then they direct you that your first call is to the social worker assigned to your child's case, not to a lawyer or maybe other people in the family or, I don't know, some sort of law enforcement. No, it's to them. And then the purpose of the Child Protective Services Act of 1973 is to encourage more complete reporting of child abuse and maltreatment. Interesting wording there. And then, oddly, in the Child Protective Services Los Angeles County Department, they say resource parents are often called upon to provide information to the Child Protective Services worker. What is resource parent, I wonder? It's probably not what we think they mean. And then, thousands of missing child welfare workers across the country have kicked thousands of missing foster care children out of the system. And the National Institute of Justice has a database called NamUs, which apparently is used for locating and recovering missing children. At least that's what we're told. And of course they raise public awareness, as if that's going to do anything. And then thousands of lost American foster. This cuts off. But then it says lost track of nearly 1,500 migrant children. Interesting. And why would they want to change the definition of orphan, I wonder? When it says, while technically no longer referred to as orphans, they're considered to be waiting children available for adoption. That doesn't sound creepy. And then on average day, according to some probably suspicious numbers that I'm sure that is much higher, says 55 children disappear from the U.S. foster care system. And an unknown number of the missing are taken and trafficked by pedophiles. Well, I doubt that they don't know the number, but they're not going to tell us what it is. And then the purpose of a company's legal department is to reduce any potential legal liability. And the legal department of a city states that they cannot provide legal advice on non-city related matters or to members of the general public. And then if you require legal assistance and cannot afford an attorney, please contact blah, blah, blah. So that's interesting. But then in a complaint that I filed to the Ohio Attorney General's office, it was recorded in their complaint system, and they said that our office educate, it's grammatically incorrect, other consumers about how to best protect themselves. Now, we might think consumers means citizens. Nope, not what it means. And we can continue to protect Ohio consumers. And of course, this is the office of Dave Yost. Now, that was an automatic reply. But the reply from a person came from a constituent liaison and constituent services and outreach. Sounds like public relations, because it is. And she said that we should speak on the phone for additional information. Now, the reason why she said that is because on the phone she told me that their office is not made to deal with concerns of the citizens, but rather to represent government officials who are taken to court for any reason or another. So they collect tax money to protect themselves against us, pretty much. And then, when we look at another element of this extremely Nazi global corporation, business, governments that we find ourselves under. The RAND Corporation is a very important mechanism or element of their structure. And in the Wikipedia article about the RAND Corporation, it says, by late 1947, Douglas had expressed their concerns that their close relationship with RAND might create conflict of interest problems on future hardware contracts. Of course, they don't really care about the conflict of interest there, they just care about the possible problems. And then, of course, the Air Force approved the Project RAND into a nonprofit corporation independent of Douglas. Now, I've never heard of a company called Project such and such. So that is interesting, because the company is not the project. The company is part of the project, it appears. And then, of course, naturally, they were funded by the Ford Foundation, which is a well-known proprietor and advocator of eugenics, and are, of course, naturally, Nazis. And then the RAND Corporation works to better the creation of the Great Society social welfare programs and national health care. How very fascist. And then the achievements of RAND can be found in artificial intelligence. And some of the principles were used to build the internet. Of course, they won't claim the invention of the internet, because that was probably stolen and used for their nefarious social program purposes. And then current areas of expertise include child policy, health, and social welfare, among all of the other ones. And let's take a look at two of the notable participants in the RAND Corporation. Arrow, who is one of those men, embraced socialism in his youth. And then this goes on to say he would later move away from socialism, but his views retained left-leaning philosophy. So he moved away from it, but not really. And then Bruno Augenstein was a German-born American. I wonder if those two were part of Operation Paperclip. And then the very disturbing NAM-US, or National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, is used to track unclaimed person cases throughout the United States. And it is funded and administered by the National Institute of Justice through a cooperative agreement with the University of North Texas Health Science Center's Center for Human Identification. And they work with allied forensic professionals.